So if you look at, I just want to do a quick check before that. If you look at Bangalore, how many of you are from Bangalore? As in, most of you? Okay, so some from outside, some from here. Just trying to get a sense of, hopefully I can, if you're from, not from Bangalore, hopefully I can get you to think about Bangalore in a different way. And if you're from Bangalore, maybe you can re-look at your city in a bit of a different way, looking at different perspectives. So I'm going to share with you some of my own journey about the city and what I've learned about this city over the past, working on this from 2006 onwards. And as Madhu mentioned, I do a lot of different kinds of work. A lot of my work before this was on forests and forest change and biodiversity, but I'm from Bangalore. And I, in 2006 or so, started thinking that we are looking at, as ecologists, cities fall in a different place through the cracks of a very interesting or important conversation. Ecologists tend to think of distant places, forests, places with biodiversity, protected areas, tigers. So they don't look at cities as places of nature. On the other hand, you can have people that work in cities, and there are some excellent books written about cities, including Indian cities, and written as though nature was at best a footnote. You know, there is no nature in the city, or there's nothing that is important about nature in the city. And anything whether it's conservation or even interacting with something like water or trees is something you can do outside. You know, you can go on the weekends, you can go for a trek, or cities need to have roads and industrialize and develop and have more GDP. And if you look at, so some of these questions that I want to look at, taking the history of Bangalore as an example. How did the city grow? What was the background to it? And why am I calling it a city of water? So let's look at the story of the founding of Bengaluru, the market city, right? And if you look at the conventional Wikipedia history, which I'm sure you've all read, there's Kempe Gowda, who is a visionary. He comes to a place which is a barren field, a grassy area, where he sees a hare chasing a hound. And this is a popular myth. It's told about the founding of the Vijayanagara Empire, about Harihara and Bukka, about many different people in many different parts of the South Asian context. A hare chasing a hound is a sign of bravery. It's something that you don't normally see. So he saw a hare chasing a hound, so goes the story. And he said, this is an important place. It's a Gandabhumi, a land of bravery, a place where I can found a new kingdom. So he came to this place which was supposed to be barren, no people on it. And he yoked 4 bullocks in 4 corners on an auspicious day, and where they stopped moving, that was the boundaries of Bangalore. So goes the mythical story, or the old story at least. We don't know how much of it is myth or reality, because obviously nobody sat down and wrote the story of Bangalore at that point. However, and that is the little red dot that you see in 1537, that is the center of Bangalore as it existed today. And the blackish boundary is the BBMP boundary of Bangalore. So you can get a sense of what was, that black is the peripheral ring road, but the other part that you can see is the wards of Bangalore and the city of Bangalore itself. Right? Now for a long time it stays the same in size. In 1862, the British come in, and then the cantonment and the town of Bangalore expands. 1941, other areas come in, and then the city starts growing. You can see roughly that the time periods between growth decrease, and the area of growth keeps increasing. So the city is growing faster and bigger. And I think we all know that we're in a water crisis today. Right? We want water from the Kaveri. Kaveri is a distant river. It has only so much water. Everybody's fighting over water. Tamil Nadu wants water. Karnataka wants water. The farmers want water. The cities want water. Where is all this water going to come from? Otherwise, we pump it from the ground. And groundwater through our bore wells, we know that's unsustainable. And in not just India, most of the world is running out of groundwater. In fact, you can see many cities subsiding because we've pulled out so much groundwater that the entire areas, you've lost space. It's becoming hollow, and many of these areas are actually sinking because of groundwater. Now, where did that come from? Is it true that Kempe Gowda came in 1537 to a barren land without people, without any civilization, without anything, and created this town? Now, that's not true, because if you go back to old records, what kinds of records can we see? You find a lot of megalithic stone tombs. And those of you who haven't gone and explored the area around Bangalore, you should. Go to the area, for instance, of Avati, close to the Bangalore International Airport. If you cross that road a little bit, you'll see Avati on the left side of the road, if you're heading out from Bangalore. It's a rocky area, and if you go into the agricultural fields near Avanti, you see some very interesting sights. You will see a small circle like this, and stones sticking out, large menhis, irregular slabs of stone sticking out around this area. You might see other kinds of stone areas in different places around Bangalore. You see one stone in another and a stone tablet on top. These are all megalithic burial tombs. So as far as we can figure out, around 8,000 years ago, there were people being buried in Bangalore, presumably living in Bangalore. You find some archaeological remains. Who they were, where they stayed, how they lived, what did they eat, what did they drink, what was their relationship to the landscape. We don't know anything about any of these. We can only speculate. But we know it's something that is interesting because Bangalore is in where, so where would ancient civilizations be? We've always heard that they're close to water sources, right? Bangalore, is there a sea? Is there a perennial river? Is there a large source of water? No. We're also in what is called a semi-arid area. That is, we receive less rainfall than a lot of the other areas around. So it's not even like the rainfall that you get is enough to see you through the year. So why would you have people 8,000 years ago coming to a land that was semi-arid and establishing some kind of a settlement here? Now that's lost in history. We really don't know the answers to those questions. What we do know is a little after that. So if you look at the time of the turn of the BC to AD time period, you can see that at that point, there are a lot of pottery urns that one can dig up in different places. We still find them. For instance, recently when they were digging for the metro, they found a bunch of these pottery urns. And they filled with coins, Roman coins, but also coins from Mesopotamia, coins from the Indus Valley civilization, coins from all kinds of places. But the quantity and diversity of coins leads historians to speculate that Bangalore must have been some sort of an international trading center. It must have been a trade route, because if it was just a local place and commerce, just live with a little bit of commerce, you wouldn't have this number and this diversity of coins from different parts of the world. Again, why on earth would you find Bangalore? It's not on a place where rivers cross. There's no overland route that we knew of, that roads, the old roads that intersected at Bangalore. It's in the middle of nowhere, as if you look at water as well as known trade routes. Why would there be so much commerce? Again, we don't know anything about this. However, when we can start piecing together the puzzle of Bangalore, that's about the 5th, 6th century, because you start finding inscriptions, and there are two kinds. You find inscriptions on copper plates, and you find inscriptions on stones. And if you start deciphering the location and the place, then you can start learning something about the history of Bangalore. So one of the first things I did was, when I was looking at this, is to look at, so again, that's the BBMP boundary, the black line. And this is what you call a digital elevation map. So this map is undulating. It gives you a sense of the topography of Bangalore. And so if you look at Bangalore, can you see these undulations? It goes up and it goes down. It goes up and it goes down. And there are really 3 ridges. There's one ridge that runs like this. There's another ridge that goes this way. And there's a third ridge that goes this way. And what you can see is that this area, this part of Bangalore, is actually quite undulating, up and down, up and down. And this is what the British, when they came to Bangalore, they were told that this is the Malnad area of Bangalore. These are the big granite rocks that you see, granite rocky outcrops in different parts of Bangalore. Not so easy to see anymore because most of them have been blasted out of existence. But any of you who have been in Bangalore for more than 20 or 30 years will remember that we used to see a lot of these boulders as we passed through the city. Now a lot of them slowly are being leveled out of our memory. Right? This part, the east, to the contrary, is much flatter. Grassy, flatter slopes. And this is what the British were told was the Maidan. In Kannada, you call it the Bailu, the grassy fields. Right? And they're very different ecologically. This area tends to be a little drier because this is the Western Ghats coming in, so this area tends to get more rainfall. This area tends to be a little drier. So you find differences in the landscape in terms of the rainfall. You also find differences in the soil. This area is very rocky, so it has very thin soil, a lot of thorny bushes, and it's very difficult to do settled agriculture here. Because how do you plow the land when things are so rocky and it's up and down, right? And there's so much of what you call jungle with thorny bushes, with a lot of wildlife coming in. This area is much better for settlers. The Maidan area. Flatter, it's easy to have agriculture, easy to bring cattle in. So you can start mapping through the inscriptions where these people came in before Kempegowda. And I've done this and broken them up into the 4 major dynasties that we can map since inscriptions start in the Bangalore area. So that is the Gangas, then the Cholas, and the Hoysalas, and then the Vijayanagar dynasty, which Kempegowda is a part of. And as you expect, you can start seeing that the first few inscriptions that you see are largely in the grassy plains in the Maidan area, because that's easier for people to settle in. Yeah? And so these are the ones. The first one is the famous Begur inscription. How many of you have been to Begur? Only one. Please go to Begur, because this is the oldest set of inscriptions that you see in Bangalore. The first inscription that talks about Bangalore and calls it Bengaluru. So that's where you know the naming of the city comes from there. There's a battle of Bengaluru which is talked about, and the inscription has recently been restored and put up on a nice pedestal with a little description by Intac of the history of the place. So Begur is very important for the city, but from Begur onwards, all the way so from 517 CE to 900 CE, you see the Ganga dynasty. There's a few settlements here, but most of them tend to be in the Maidan area. Then the Cholas. A few more inscriptions come in, people but still stay mostly in the plains, right? That's where you come in and stay. And what do they do in these plains? Remember, I posed the conundrum about what do they do with water? Why are they here? So you get a sense after some time, if you look at the Hoysala dynasty. Hoysala dynasty, of course, we know, is a very famous dynasty that is across South India. And they're inveterate tank builders. So all the lakes that we see in and around Bangalore today, most of them were, some of them were created, of course, before, because Begur has a large lake, for instance, next to it, and we don't know when it was created, but presumably it was created by that, around the time of 517 AD. We can speculate. But definitely you know by the time of the Hoysala dynasty that they're creating a lot of these tanks and networking them in a topographical way. You can see the undulations. So the typical Hoysala way of construction is a lake that is upstream is connected to the one downstream with a channel. You deepen the channel and water flows. So when you get a lake and you get a lot of water, it overflows into the next lake and the next. So you don't waste any water, but there's this downstream cascading effect. And therefore you also prevent flooding. We have two problems in our cities today. Floods, because when this rains, there's too much water, and drought, because the water is not being held the rest of the year. So this is what they do with their lakes. They set this up, and you can see how they set this up and get, again, inferences that you... So our history is not written down, neatly described history like Western Europe's history. It's very difficult. You have to read the traces of this landscape. But what you can see is the Sandra, the name. So Honga Sandra, the first one. Sandra is a corruption of the word Samudra. Samudra, we tend to think of a Samudra as an ocean or the sea, but Samudra is actually a large body of water. So all the Sandras, Singa Sandra, Malla Sandra, Junna Sandra, Honga Sandra, many of you would have heard these names, Sandras, across wherever, different parts of Bangalore where you live. All of these are large bodies of water. Then you can look at Tawar Kere, 5. Kere is another body of water. Okay? Let's look at Belur Nagasandra, 16, or 1920, Mallasandra, Singasandra. 21, Kunte, Suli Kunte. Kunte is a smaller body of water, and you use it for different kinds of purposes. So the large bodies of water you used for irrigation. You had wells next to that give you domestic supply. The smaller bodies of water like a Kunte would be used for cattle to drink or for domestic use, for washing clothes. Soli in Kannada means prostitute. So a local legend says that this was built by a local prostitute who used her earnings to build a lake for the good of the community. So it's not just the kings, that's what I want to emphasize. It's also commoners, it's people who, through all kinds of sacrifices, built these lakes for the good of the people in conjunction with the kings. So if you look at Agara 8, that's the first inscription in Bangalore that tells us about the existence of a lake. And I'm sure most of you know of Agara Lake. But this particular inscription talks about the fact that there is the king, the Ganga king, grants to the local chieftain in that area money for the upkeep of a cart to take the silt from that lake. So you clean up the lake, every year you do desilting, and that requires a cart and then various other things, presumably labor and other things. So it's for the upkeep of the cart to clean that lake and to then get the irrigation rights for the area downstream of that lake, as well as the other 2 lakes around it. We don't know what these 2 lakes are. So people speculate now. One might be Madiwala, the other one might be Belandur, or maybe there are lakes that have disappeared now. But this is the oldest inscription in Bangalore. Okay? 870 AD is when we first hear of the existence of these lakes. So then there's the Chola, then the Hoysala. Also start seeing that people are moving up because the good places have been taken. They're also moving. So let's look at this. So they started here, early settlement was here. Then they start moving up, and when I say up, I mean uphill to the more rocky places, the less hospitable places, the places where it's harder to do agriculture. But they're still going there, and they're establishing lakes. I'll show you later an inscription which talks about how they actually create the lakes. And then the Vijayanagara dynasty, I've stopped at 1533 because Kempegowda comes by 1538, but of course inscriptions continue. It's just that I'm not looking at that record. But if you put all of this together, you see that by the time Kempegowda came into this supposedly barren landscape, where no one was there, there's at least 75 villages with this inscriptional record. There are actually many more. There are many inscriptions that I could not identify the name location for, because the names have changed. It talks about a particular place and the place has gone no. Or these inscriptions have disappeared. Of these inscription stones, there are about 250 odd that are described there's a massive volume called Epigraphia Carnatica. Again, those of you who are interested, this is downloadable online, completely free. And you can start digging into what the inscription archives say. There's also a very interesting group which is called the Inscription Stones of Bengaluru. They go from place to place, hunt down these stones, preserve them, talk to local people and get them kept at site. So they're very much against the idea of moving these stones into museums. They say they should be living records for people to understand the history of their place and to take pride in Bangalore. So there's a lovely Inscription Stones of Bengaluru Facebook page which you can read and look at all these new, very, very exciting when you find a stone that you think has been completely lost. And so they've dug out stones, rescued them from graveyards, from building places, from being broken apart for construction. But all of these inscriptions are here. So you see the one thing that there were at least 75 of these villages. And we know that when Kempegowda created Bangalore, he actually got a Jagir. So at that time, he was Jagir of the Vijayanagara Empire. Right? He owed allegiance to the Vijayanagara Empire. So he got a Jagir from Achyuta Deva Raya, the famous Krishna Deva Raya's brother, who took over from him as king for some time after he died, was very pleased. When people create new cities or new towns, the king in charge is usually very pleased because you're expanding the economy. And so he gave him a grant of 20 plus villages around the Bangalore region, saying you can use the money from this for your market town. And so that again tells you, he must have no doubt been a visionary. But he was not, it's impossible to create a vision from scratch. There was something that was underlying in these places, and that something was water. These places were built on a flourishing landscape of water. So what kinds of landscapes do you see? What else can we see from the inscriptions? We can see the locations of these places. What else do we see? We see that these were in the plains, a fertile landscape of agriculture which is supported by tanks. And this is a very typical inscription from these. There are lots of these inscriptions. I'm just taking one which talks about a land grant. Essentially, most of the inscriptions in these places are land grant inscriptions in the Maidan that you see, in the plains that you see. And this says that here is a land that the king is granting for the upkeep of the temple, the Devadana for the god. What is the grant? Look at the construction of this language, and you will see this language repeated in inscription after inscription. It talks about this grant as comprising the village, the tank, which is called the Avanji Kattu of the village, and all the wetlands and the dry lands. Wetlands are the irrigated rice areas, the dry lands are the non-irrigated paddy. Okay. And including the wells underground and the trees overground. Where in today's imagination do we imagine a landscape as consisting of wells giving life-giving water underground and trees overground? In fact, most people, I know in my ancestral home there was this very large well. It was then filled in and sold off and parceled as a site. Someone's built on it. Right? And which is very typical. We have these large open wells that we have no idea where they are anymore. So the wells underground are not part of the land now. The trees overground, just forget it. We're cutting the trees everywhere. There's no chance that a tree is part of the survey documents of that land. But here you're saying that this land includes wells underground and trees overground. It's a three-dimensional picture. It's a life-giving picture. They understand that without the trees and without the water, you can't have any kind of life in this area. The Malnad or the hills have very different inscriptions. They're not land grants. They're usually hero stones of brave warriors who die either with cattle raids or with death from tiger attacks or boar attacks. And these are still the biodiversity rich areas, Bannerghatta National Park, areas around that. That's where you talk about tiger attacks, boar attacks, and this death of Sokka Illington and his dogs. So there are hunting dogs clearly that were there, which were used for boar hunts. You get again a picture of the landscape, which is a very different landscape. In this part of Bangalore, there is no agriculture. It's mostly cattle, pastoralism. Again, think of this. We are looking at Bangalore as a a landscape split between two kinds of geological regions. One is rocky, thin soil, thorny bushes, inhospitable to people doing settled agriculture, not as much water. And the other is the area which has tanks, which has waterscapes, where you can actually have agriculture and you can move around. What did they do in these places? This is the Agra inscription. So in 870 AD, be it well, under this reign of the Satavakyas Kali Yuga Hanuman, Nagattara, who is the Vadiya or the ruler of this particular place, under his rule, Irugamaya's son Sirimaya fixed sluices to two tanks, had the eastern tank built and obtained the Bittu Vata, which is the tax-free rights to agriculture downstream of the tank for these three tanks. Which are these three tanks? We don't know. The Agra inscription is lost. So if you talk, there are two Agra lake restorations that have happened. One is more recent, 2 years ago, but one happened about the late 1990s. And if you talk to people who are involved in that restoration, they say, oh yes, the stone was there sometime. And you talk to the village, they remember seeing the stone, but it's not where anybody says it is. So that stone has been lost. It's just somebody thankfully documented this, so we have the record of the documentation, but the stone itself is gone. As I said, what are the other two tanks? We have no idea. Are they the tanks that we see now, or are they tanks that have been completely lost? Why did they do this? So the other thing you get here is motivations. People write down why they constructed these tanks. One woman said that she created the tank, and it's a woman, for the support of animals, cattle, birds, all other living beings, and the service at all times of the goddess Ganga. So you can see that this is public service that she's doing here. Others do this for personal merit or merit of their future generations. So one woman did it in order that her husband and other relatives for 21 generations might obtain merit. But again, you get the idea that this is community service done for merit, either done just for universal merit, throw it open for the cattle and the goddesses and the birds and everything else, or it's personal merit, your own generations. Or a man did it in 1515 AD, there's one of the inscriptions, in order that dharma might come to be to his father. So in the name of his father, you get it done. If you go around Bangalore, even now, you see Sisindris, which is a different kind of tank. Any of you have heard the term? Know what it is? So you've seen kattes, these large platforms with trees in different parts of Bangalore, in the villages around Bangalore. So traditionally, every katte would have a Sisindri, which is a small platform with 4 slabs of stone, creating a small water tank, this size, filled with water. And the idea again was somebody wealthy or influential from that local community would fill that with water all the time, so that passers-by would get water, especially in the summer. So they would arrange to clean it, fill it with good drinking water, and that water anybody could drink free of charge. And again, the idea is often of merit. So a few places that we have seen these tanks surviving, you typically have a photo of the person's parents, for instance. And the parents are deceased now, but the person is maintaining it in the name of his parents, with the idea that they will get merit in the afterlife because of the good deeds he is doing today. Right? So that's again water as an idea of not just the water that is below, that is invisible, but water is an idea of service. Water is an idea of a cultural connect to your landscape. All of these ideas, many of these we can see embedded even now. How long did they expect these land grants, these lakes, these wells to survive? So they have various phrases. So I build this lake and give it to the service of the goddess as long as the sun and the moon endure, or as long as the rocks are there, as long as the Kaveri is there, as long as the grass and the earth are there. And to help this stay, you don't want this lake to be filled in or somebody has to take it away or this well to go, you write powerful curses. What are the curses? The violator shall incur the sin of having slaughtered cows and Brahmins, shall be born worms in ordure, in filth. Or my truly favorite curse will be born the husband of his own mother. he who violates this. Right? So you can see you really don't want this to be violated, and you're doing all that you can, which is in your power at that point, to stop this. And how did they create these lakes? So this is one inscription I wanted to show you, because of the lot, this is the inscription that talks about the process in the most detail. It's in Vibhutipura. And it says that in 1307 from this particular year, it's a Tamil inscription. So again, there are many things in the culture of water that you can see. Approximately a third of these inscriptions are in Telugu, a third are in Tamil, a third are in Kannada, and then a few of whatever's left is in Sanskrit. And we talk so much today about linguistics and Bangalore being a Kannada-based city, and saying that immigrants are moving into Bangalore. But Bangalore was always a place of mixed influences. Even at this time, you have a third of the inscriptions are Tamil, a third of the inscriptions are Kannada, a third of the inscriptions are Telugu, and a smattering of Sanskrit. So we've always been a place that was open to people who came in on all sides. This particular inscription in Tamil talks about, for the benefit of various gods, the superintendent of that particular place and they've named 3 inhabitants of the Nadu of the place. What do? They cleared the jungle in this tract of land. Then they leveled the ground. Then they built a village. Then they scooped out the sand in an existing depression, because that's what they would do. They would come to areas that are marshy, that are depressions, and then they scoop out the sand. And then named the village Vachidevapuram, and then granted to the village, that is to the god, the wet and the dry lands with their 4 boundaries, exempt from taxes as long as the moon and sun exist. So you can see this process. You come into a place, you level the land, you clear the jungle, you find the deepest point, scoop out the mud, start rainwater harvesting. And from our research to the areas around Bangalore, because if you go to the surroundings of Bangalore, you see that many of these places are the kinds of places that Bangalore used to have but has lost. So you get a sense of what landscape existed. So Agara, for instance, if we'd done one detailed study on the lake of Agara, and we find that till the 1980s, it was used very much as a village lake is used even on the periphery of Bangalore. So this lake is the lake. There's always a temple, of course. There are agricultural fields. There is always an open well to the east and to the west. Large open well for public use. But given the fact that we have also the unfortunate caste system, which we must be recognizing in these communities, a lot of these lakes were built on Dalit labor, and these 2 wells are for different caste groups. So some can use one well, some can use another well. And there are others who cannot use any of the wells. There are stories of human sacrifices around these. So many of these wells, there would be lakes, there's a story always of a breach in the lake, where usually a pregnant woman or a baby is sacrificed by walling it up. And so you hear these stories, which are very unfortunate, where people will tell you, don't walk in this place at night, or don't talk too loud because there's a child crying who will get disturbed. So there are these memories also. These lakes were built by communities, but not always by voluntary contribution, often by forced labor as well as voluntary contribution. So it's not just this very nice story of people getting together and cooperation, though that's also there. The ecology, as I said, was improved because you created these lakes and then you start changing this entire landscape. So next to that is a grazing area. Typically on the western side, you'll have a large gaumala or a grazing area. You have an area called a Gundatop, which is a wooded lot of trees: jackfruit, coconut, mango, a few banyan trees, tamarind. Largely useful trees. And the idea would be once every 4-5 years in a village festival, you would cut one of these trees and use them for timber. But you would also use the fruit. And it would give you shade, so when you're grazing your cattle, you can sleep under the trees during the day. So that's that entire landscape. It's not just the lake. It's a lake plus the wells, plus the grazing area, plus the forest, the woodlot, plus that entire landscape around that, which is a social and a cultural landscape, which Agara also had. So Agara had 4 wells, for instance, which are all gone now. They're under the ring road. So then comes Kempegowda from this landscape onwards, and we hear only stories of Kempegowda and what lakes and tanks were there, but there's nothing that's written down, nothing that we can actually understand about how he governed this land. However, once Kempegowda dynasty goes away, it's replaced by the famous Shivaji's father, Shahji, who comes at the head of the Bijapur Sultanate. They march to Bangalore, Nandi Hills, all of these areas around, take this entire area. And Shahji is gifted the Jagir of Bangalore, the rulership of Bangalore, in exchange for this task that he did for the Bijapur Sultanate. So this becomes a province of the Marathas for some time. And at that time, Shahji has a court poet, Parmanand, who writes this long poem in Sanskrit, which talks about Bangalore. So that's the first written, apart from these inscriptions, first written documentation of Bangalore. And let's just look at the lake description part of it. The Marathas called it Bingrul. And it said the city resounded with coos of pigeons. It was animated by the calls of peafowl. But the city teemed with deep lakes. So the lakes persisted till then. Each house was graced by a well. There were fountains at every square spouting a fine mist. There were trees which lined each home garden. The city itself was girdled by a bottomless moat glimmering with water and dotted with countless lakes, each as big as a sea. So the Samudra metaphor comes back here. There were parks festooned with creepers, and Shahji ruled here like Indra in his paradise, enjoying every sport and pastime with his kinsfolk. So you can see the importance of lakes continues down to Parmanand's description of Bangalore, presumably sometime in the 1640s, because he's talking in 1638, Shahji takes over Bangalore. So presumably, give or take a few years, it's sometime in the 1640s description. Now what do we see? We see a city today. This is Bangalore, and this is the three valleys that you get. So topographically, if you go to the highest point in Bangalore, from there there's drainage going in three different directions. And these are the three valleys of Bangalore, all the lakes with the drainages. This is as of the 1670s. Already by the 1670s, you see the big hole in the center of Bangalore. That hole is not a natural hole. It's not like there were no lakes there. But it's the fact that by the time we came to the 1970s, a lot of these lakes were filled in and taken over for various kinds of uses. And I'll get to why that was there. But today what happens is builders and planners don't consider what is very obvious to us centuries ago. But the fact that there was a Malnad, there's a Maidan. So you do different kinds of, you can't do agriculture and livestock rearing in a city of today at that scale. That can't be the permanent occupation that we do. But at least we need to know where we build our houses. If you're in a rocky area, should you actually be drilling down? And then what happens in a time of flood, for instance? Are you on unstable terrain? What happens if you're in a marshy area and they're filled in and you're still building there? What happens to that area in times of flood and drought? We don't consider that, except when in times of flooding or drought or climate change. And we're seeing increasingly that this is a city where we need to understand the topography. We need to understand what is going on under the ground, what happened to the wells below the ground, what happened to the trees above the ground. But we've forgotten that. So what happens after Shahji? Number of people come and go. The Mughals rule it for some time. The Mysore kings come. Tipu comes. Hyder Ali comes. Tipu is there. In 1791, Tipu Sultan loses Bangalore temporarily for a year and a half to the British in the Third Anglo-Mysore War. And when the British come in, what they do is what the British do best. They draw maps and they write down stories of what they see, documentation of what they see. So this is the map of Bangalore at 1791. And look, I've called this cantonment boundary, but obviously there was no cantonment there. This is just to give you a sense of where the cantonment was at that point. What Bangalore was at that point was this, the Pete area, the city, and this is the fort where the king lived. Right? So there's the Pete, the Kote and the Pete. And around this was the moat and a few trees, thorny trees, which is the fortification to the Pete, and lakes everywhere. Very few trees, but so many lakes all over the place. Little lakes, big lakes, kuntes, to all the way to samudras. This is how it looked like. We can also see this in paintings. Very open terrain, very few trees. So what you see here, these are the cypress trees which are of Lal Bagh. And you can see this was the one park that we had, Lal Bagh at that time. And then the kattes. You can see a katte here. So the tradition of the kattes and the tradition of the gundtops. If you talk to people with their oral histories, they say that this idea of the gundtops or the woodlots that I was talking about with the jackfruit and the mango, that apparently was an idea instituted by Hyder Ali, as was the idea of the kattes, because he was very interested in developing commerce in the region. So he wanted to make sure that bullock carts could go from village to village and connect every village. So in every 2-day interval, you would have a gundutop, or a 1-day interval, you would have a gundutop. But every half-day interval, you would have a village with a katte and this sisindri, because you could have shade and you could get water. And it didn't really matter if you hadn't eaten for 2 days, but without shade and without water, you would die. Right? So that's how, at least people say. Now we don't know if it was Hyder Ali or someone else, but people say that it was Hyder Ali who started with this. Definitely we can see that there are kattes at this point. This is Bangalore in the 1880s. Between the 1790s and 1880s, a great deal of things have changed. The British have come, the cantonment has been started. They planted a lot of trees because they found the heat unbearable. So they wanted to green this city and make it more livable for their English temperaments. But they also created a lot of lakes. Alsur Lake was there when they came in, but they make it much larger. So this is the size of Alsur Lake you can see here. And there's a number of other lakes. This was also there. This was Dharmambudhi Lake, which is now the bus stand. And there's Kempambudhi Lake and a number of other lakes in this area. But they also create new lakes. They start, because there are more people and you need more water. So more people require more water, more people require more trees. You're improving the landscape constantly to suit your human needs. You're improving the ecology, and you realize that population growth requires nature for its survival. That's the idea that they had very clearly then. And the last lake they created a number of lakes, Miller Tank series, this Alsur Lake expansion, Shule Lake was developed. A number of lakes till they create Sankey. And when they create the Sankey tank, Colonel Sankey, who creates it, says at that point that we're done because there is no more place in Bangalore. What do we do if we get more people? Because there's actually no physical place for these lakes. Then what happens is 1890s, 1891 to 93, there's a series of 3 years of drought. And the lakes are not sufficient to provide water for people. So that's when the first idea starts of getting piped water from the outside. So there's a series of lakes which is just outside Bangalore. They create a chain from that and start getting piped water. And the original idea is that of the Mysore Maharaja, not that of the British. He says for his people, so Bangalore is divided in a very odd way into the cantonment, which is governed by the British, and the rest of it, which is governed by the Mysore Maharaja. So he says he's going to get water down from these series of lakes for his people. But then the British make a bargain with him saying, we'll give you some other land, we'll give you a couple of lakes, but give us also pipe water. So instead, it's an important point at which a fundamental decision was made. They could have just supplemented water to the lakes in Bangalore from these lakes outside and continued the process as usual. So the lakes and the wells would have continued to serve their purpose. You're just getting additional water. They didn't do that. They replaced the water supply, which was local, from water supply from outside. So now Bangalore gets completely transformed into a city that relies on water from outside, piped water. At that time in the archives, you start seeing a complete change in the way we've dug into a lot of archival documents, how they talk about water. So they used to talk about water as life-giving, sacred. Every one of these lakes have Kere Devate, a goddess around. They have lake festivals. They have these different kinds of, at the time of the year, for instance, when the lake overflows, is a time of great celebration. You would create a rice lamp, a large boat, which is essentially a large rice lamp, and fill that with oil, put a goat at one end and float it from one side of the river to the other, and then have a feast at the end of this entire thing, because it was a feast for water. All of this changes. They start talking about lakes as malarial, dirty, swampy, places of filth, places to be closed, places to be filled. And lakes should not be there. They are these sources of spiritual and mental and physical disease. You completely see a change in the way they talk about these lakes. Wells you get to see, because there was a time in 1892 when there was a huge plague, and nobody wants to be found with a corpse at home at the time of the plague, because then your entire family is taken away into these camps which are kept outside the city. And it's a pretty sure shot that if you go to the camp, you're very likely to die, because these camps only for the plague affected victims. So people started to avoid the discovery of the corpses, throwing them into wells. And if you know the Indian idea of using a well, you can see that if you throw a corpse into a well, tomorrow you might clean up the well with potassium permanganate or chemical treatment. You will never use water from that well, because in your mind it is a contaminated well, right? So the fact that people were relying on these life-giving wells and suddenly piped water comes in and that changes your entire relationship, because you get water from the outside. So you see this very paradoxical thing. If you look at, again, central Bangalore, near the telephone industries, if you know that part of Bangalore, which is just behind Baldwin Girls' School, you will see there's a temple to the Kere Amma. The lake is no longer there. The lake has become partly a stadium, partly ITI. But the Kere Amma, the temple is still there. So it's a very, you can separate the object that was being worshipped, which is water, from the worship itself and continue. So this is how Bangalore looked in the 1890s. And then you see 2015. Just one survives in the center. That's Alsur, and you can see it's half of the size that it used to be. So all the army areas you see around Alsur now used to be lake. Half of that lake is also gone. So this is the story of the change that happens at that point. And you see that as the city gets piped water, lakes and wells become polluted. As the city gets hotter, more trees are planted though, because they continue to plant trees, because you still see the importance of trees. That goes by about 1990s when they start cutting down trees for the expansion of various roads and infrastructure, highways and whatnot. But this is one point I want to make. And if you look at the number of wells, we've also done a study, for instance, if you look at maps from the 1880s, 1930s and 1970s, in the 1880s, in that area which was old Bangalore, whatever was Bangalore at that time, had 1,495 wells mapped on that. These were large wells. They're not going to every house and mapping the well in that house which serves the inhabitants, because every house anyway had a well. These are the public wells that serve the city, 1,495 wells. And then when we went back, in the 1970s map, there are 49 wells. From 1,495 to 49. And then we went well by well to try and find them, and we find something like 7 wells still there. And they were all physical structures half crumbled. Like Cubbon Park had a well, but it was half crumbled. Lal Bagh had a well. Couple of other places. Nobody used them functionally as well. So we've lost that entire well culture. However, what people have done later is to protect the wells. So now what happens in Bangalore? By the time you get to the story of today, you're again seeing a transformation. You see a lot of people who want to revive and protect lakes. A lot of lake communities have come up. A lot of lake protection activities have happened. If you trace that, a lot of that can be traced actually to discussions around water. So you find that people are talking about the fact that water is disappearing from the ground. Because the periphery of Bangalore, the areas that became the new part of Bangalore, don't get Kaveri water. Now the pipelines have just been laid. And if Kaveri will supply water to them or not is unclear. So where's the water coming from? Coming from groundwater. And since I live in one of these peripheral areas, I can tell you that in the past 15 years or so, tanker prices have at least tripled, if not more. In the summers, it's almost impossible to find a tanker because you need to get to know the tanker people really well and establish a relationship with them and make sure they take your calls, because they're always getting calls and they're very much in demand. But people have really figured out that the lack of groundwater is linked to the loss of these water bodies. And we can see that Kaikondrelli Lake, which I'll show you a photograph of soon, has a large open well near it. And we saw that when the lake was emptied for restoration and they dug up the water, the groundwater went down dramatically. And then when the lake was filled with water after 2 years of rain, the water levels came back in that open well. So you can really see this very visually, and people understand that, which is why this entire resurgence in saving lakes. However, what kind of shift in the values of water? Because water is not just physical, it's not just something in the lake, it's also the cultural and the social and the imaginations that we have of water. How have these lakes changed? They used to be these kinds of places. You had people washing cattle, washing clothes, you had the dhobis, you had people, the migrant workers who used these for washing, and they supported livelihood. So the lady there is picking these greens called Vonagane Sappu, and what you find is there are things that they call rubber sappu, which they used to feed their cattle. There are a lot of these areas where, so you have, these are seasonal lakes, right? They expand in some years when you have a lot of rainfall, they retreat in other years when you didn't have rainfall. So the years when you had a lot of rainfall and a big lake, large boundaries, you had a lot of rice. You had a lot of fish. What did you do in the dry years? The lake retreats. But you get these greens. So you pluck the greens and that's still edible nutrition. Or you pluck them and give them to your cattle and you get milk. So there's always something. That landscape, as it advances and as it retreats, you very rarely starve, you very rarely thirst. You might be on the edge, but you very rarely completely decimated. So the lakes were important for all of these. Now, unfortunately, what you have is a lot of these lakes that are restored, but with the idea of recreation. You have gates, you have timings, you have lists of do's and don'ts if you go there. No plucking, no swimming, no bathing, no taking the water for this, no taking the water for that. Which is, to some extent you can understand. For instance, you don't want washing of clothes to pollute a lake. But when you say no in this huge numbers, you're also doing very short-sighted things. For instance, all of our lakes have sewage going into them. And that's something we cannot avoid, whether they're in the heart of the city or whether they're in the periphery, however good the sewage infrastructure is. And when you have sewage, you have nitrogen going in and phosphorus going in. When you have nitrogen and phosphorus entering your lake, you get a lot of plant growth, which is why you get these eutrophication. You see these water weeds that have completely choked and filled up all of these polluted lakes. What does having cows do to this landscape? You have grass also that grows, reedy grass that grows in these areas. And the cows come and eat that grass. And that's what they've always done, because these lakes have always had sewage. Not to the extent that they have, because we have many more people in the city now. But the cows are the best way of pulling that nitrogen and phosphorus out. Your sewage treatment plants will not do that. They will remove other things, but they will not remove the nitrogen and phosphorus. So when you clean up water in an STP and send it back to the lake, it's a recipe for disaster unless you have your cows. So we have the fishermen. That's the other thing we found. When you work with lakes, most community groups will tell you that the fishermen are the best people who are always at the lake, telling you when there's a breach in the lake or when somebody is trying to divert something, pump water into the lake, throw debris into the lake, because they're there. They're there day and night to guard their fish. And they're the ones who are putting the midnight bun to actually stop some sewage water that somebody's encroached into your lake with. Right? But we now want to say that fishermen should not be allowed in the lakes, that tender contracts should not be allowed, that these should not be commercial places. We want the birds, we don't want the fish. These are stocked lakes. They've always been stocked with fish. So there are a number of oddities in the way we think of these lakes as just... So again, one of my favorite stories is when I was talking to a person who's from a group that did a lot of work, very commendable work, in a lake somewhere in the outskirts of Bangalore, to restore this lake, to create a lovely water body. Now the water that comes in is heavily polluted. So you can see foaming, not as bad as Belundur Lake's foaming, but you can see foam coming into the upstream part of the lake. And there are a lot of water weeds and reeds. So he came to ask if we could help him figure out what kind of a machine could actually pluck these weeds out and clean up the lake. What we were trying to explain to him was that these weeds are important for biodiversity because there's a lot of birds nesting in this area, but they're also important because they are the ones who are cleaning the foam. If you look at the water coming out of your lake, it's relatively clean. The water that's coming to your lake is fairly disgusting. And so you want your weeds here to protect this water. But he kept coming back to the fact that the residents group that walks around the lake wants to see water. So at the end, we had this discussion where I got a bit more annoyed than I should have, but also I was asking, do you want to see a bathtub or do you want to see a lake? And then you start thinking about what is a lake. Is it a swimming pool? Is it a bathtub? Is it a collection of water? Or is it a cultural space which is also an ecological space, which is also a hydrological space? And you have to think of the lake as all of these. It's, for us, we can say as science we should, and I think it's part of our educational training that we say the educated realize this, but frankly, if you look at it, the people who we call the uneducated and living in these villages understood this far better than us. The people who wrote these inscriptions, the people who protected these landscapes, the woman who made Suli Kunte, I think had a far better appreciation of it than we have, unfortunately. So you have these lakes that are being rejuvenated for water recharge, for nature watching, for bird watching, and for recreation, but not for the grazers, not for the fishers, and not for the village communities who for generations have used this lake. Because in lake after lake, when we go there and talk to the people, they say, oh, we were the villagers that protected this lake, but we are now excluded from this lake. They have no say in the protection, in the restoration, in the management, or the plans that were created. How is this lake going to be governed? But so I'm coming to the end of this, so I don't want to leave you with a sense of despondency and no hope. So I thought I'll talk a bit about one of the lakes that I know well, Kaikondrelli Lake, where I've also been working for a long time. But also encourage you to look at two other lakes, the Puttenhalli Lake in JP Nagar and the Jakkur Lake. And all three lakes, I think, are doing very interesting experiments in lake rejuvenation, which think beyond this, which go beyond it in very different areas. Interestingly, all three lake restorations led by very dynamic women who have taken this in a very different direction. So Priya Ramasubban started this with Kaikondrelli Lake, and Usha in the Puttenhalli JP Nagar Lake, and then Annapurna, Dr. Annapurna Kamath in Jakkur Lake. Very interesting work. I'll tell you a little bit about Kaikondrelli. This is the place as it looked like in 2007. Very swampy, lots of carcasses. The lake was being encroached by some powerful real estate interests. There's a borewell in the lake. The group of residents came together, started restoration, and the lake now looks like this. In fact, in 2009, Eleanor Ostrom, who is the only before Esther Duflo was the only woman to have ever won the Nobel Prize in Economics, who worked on communities, came to the lake and planted a jackfruit tree, recognizing the importance of the community efforts at this lake. The lake now has over 100 species of birds, lots of pelicans. If you come in the right season, you'll see painted stalks. You can see 100 plus painted stalks. So it's a spectacular sight in the heart of the city. You have fish, you have the birds, you have the people, and we are not allowed to have cows coming in because of the problems with the lake and the road and access by the BBMP, but the residents have worked out an arrangement by which local residents in the villages around can come with their bike. Other bikes are not allowed in the lake, but you can cut grass for free and take it away. It's still not the same, as it's more labor for them than letting the cows graze free, but still, you still have some element of grazing. Similarly, if you go to the Jakur lake, Annapurna Kamath there has worked out an arrangement where the local village women can have a medicinal plant nursery which they use, and then they train and tell people about how to grow these plants, as well as there's cattle grazing, and there's fish. And the fishermen work with the local sewage treatment plant, the recycled water sent into the lake, and they're the ones who monitor the lake and tell you when it's in danger and how much nutrient can actually go into nutrient load the lake in. So there are trajectories, there are stories of hope, and I think that's where we want to go. But I'd like to step us back and just sort of what have we learned through this entire experience. We really see that in Bangalore there have been three trajectories or three time periods of change. The first was of degradation and disappearance. The local use of water was broken. People used to use water locally, they went to piped water. And then what happened was lakes were valued as ecosystems, but they became wasteland. Became places for real estate grabs. And that's really the tragedy of the commons that you hear about. Then you had another welcome trend towards lake protection, fencing, boundaries, but unfortunately what happened is many of these lakes have become private places for recreation. So there might be a real estate community or a gated community inside its boundaries, the lake is there, and that becomes a place only for them. Or there's a set of people who are excluded, or no grazing. The focus is on gates and timings and security guards. And then the third, how can we restore these lakes as true organic commons? And there are a number of these experiments, not just the three I spoke about, but there are a number of really excellent experiments. ActionAid is doing some really good work with a number of lakes that are being conserved. What they do is they're saying explicitly that they're not landscaping their lakes. They're going to leave them as slightly wild places around these paths. And they're not going to have a path around the entire lake. So that you have some places for biodiversity as well as for people. So there are all of these experiments that we need to work and learn from, because these are the true organic commons from which we learn. And that, I think, to me is really the water bodies of the lakes. That they're commons, they're not just ecological spaces or hydrological spaces. But finally, and so what? Is this just the story of one city? Is this just Bangalore? Look at this chart which tells you the growth of cities from 1990 to 2014. And you'll see that India, China, Nigeria are the fastest urbanizing countries in the world. As a world, we're already more than 50% urban. We're about 55% urban. And projections say that by 2050 or so, we'll be more than 80% urban. So the cities of tomorrow are going to be in these countries, India, China, Nigeria. Our experience is not that of the European countries. Our experience will not be that of the American countries. It's going to be that of stories of places like Bangalore. Unless Bangalore can figure out how to protect its lakes, unless Mumbai can figure out how to protect the Mithi River, unless Calcutta can figure out how to protect the East Kolkata wetlands or Delhi the Yamuna River, the small cities and towns have no hope. Because we are the ones with a supposedly better management system, more money, more people who can actually have the skills to intervene with these things. So I think the story of Bangalore and the story of places like Bangalore really gives are very important to understand the history of the past and how to move towards a future which is going to be an urban India. So it's really a parallel to stories of cities across the world. And finally, the last thought I'd like to leave you with is that Bangalore grew over hundreds and thousands of years, not because of its people, but because of its attention, the attention that they gave to the ecology, that they gave to the water, that they gave to the lakes, that they gave to the trees. Each time more and more people came in till the 1890s. They created more lakes and planted more trees. So I think this leaves us, what we've seen now, this breakdown of the relationship with lakes, the breakdown of the relationship with trees is very recent. With trees, till the 1990s, people were planting them. So it's barely 25 years, 30 years that we've broken down this relationship. But yet you find people everywhere saying that it's inevitable. When a city grows, you can't protect the ecology anymore. You need to have development. But you can't have, I think what Bangalore story tells us, you can't have development without protection of ecology. You must have development building on ecology, otherwise it's not going to last. And so I think we need to look at our history to understand how to manage our future. So with that I'll end and we can have
I found this a very interesting group of people because I didn't expect that the audience would be this interested and this engaged. I mean, the number of people who were, you can make eye contact and see people were really listening and asking questions. A lot of very good questions that I saw. I also really like the exhibition. I think I found a lot of people engaging with this in very diverse ways, looking at little bits of information that were out there.